Welcome to Brain in a Vat. We are delighted to be rejoined by one of our most infamous guests. I think Stephen Kershnar is the person who has brought much to light to many people in the world. Our show was featured on the New York Times because of our prior episodes with Steve. We only have one episode that's ever been banned, and it's Steve's. But if you want to listen to the audio version of that, you're welcome to check it out on Spotify. So we're going to be talking about affirmative action and anti-racist programs. Steve, would you like to start with a real-life case?
So yes, I do think that is a reason to have affirmative action in favor of some groups if they're going to produce greater medical care. You're going to need to trade this off against reduced performance, right? So if you have a big difference in performance, but if your patients are much more sympathetic to seeing someone or have a better, are more able to talk to them, then yeah, that's a good reason. I guess I just don't see what reason there is to think that that's actually an effect, right? In plenty of fields, we have a very skewed distribution of individuals. As far as I could tell, this doesn't disrupt the distribution of services. So, for example, veterinary services are heavily women. I see no indication that this produces, a reduction in veterinary services. I'm not sure why we would see this in other areas, although perhaps you'd have a certain familiarity in things like OBGYN. Still, though, so we need to know, okay, so we're balancing off two things. Groups which have in-group preferences versus differences in performance and perhaps also in the amount of services, right? So some groups, for example, when you hire female physicians, they're much less likely to work full-time. So, for example, in Britain, I think my dad is a little bit old, but I think like roughly 40% of female physicians in Britain don't work full time. And in the US, I think it's roughly 25%. So when you have female physicians, you're getting a lot fewer medical hours from them, even if their services were just as good, and even if the patients would prefer them. So again, we're balancing off in this case kind of the patient's preference versus an increase in quality, and perhaps in some cases an increase in quantity. Okay, so how do we balance those off? I tend to think what we should do is we look at other markets, right? We say, okay, so if we don't know, what the market prefers, we say, okay, well, what do other markets prefer? Do other markets prefer, heterogeneity or diversity, or they prefer sort of performance? And the answer seems to be pretty consistently that they prefer performance. And I'll just give you 4 examples. 2 of them are performance-based, and 2 of them are not. If we look at things like Hollywood, there's a huge problem with diversity, right? There's just a huge overrepresentation of some groups, particularly whites, compared to other groups. When it comes to professional sports, there's a huge maldistribution of races. For example, an NHL hockey team, the starting players on the championship team might be all white. And in an NFL football team, the starting players, for example, on a defense, might be sort of all black or all but one black, something like that. Do people seem to prefer diversity in those cases, or they seem to prefer performance? They seem to prefer performance. So on the other hand, when it comes to social things, there seems to be a strong preference for homogeneity. So for example, if you look at marriage is heavily in group, and friends are heavily in group. So that suggests that there's a strong in-group preference. So I guess I think, okay, well, the market seems to be split, but I guess what I would say there is, to the extent that we have performance-based markets, they in general seem to prefer those individuals that perform better over those individuals that are more similar. It's unclear why we think that something's different true for medicine that's true for anything else.
So one of the challenges being a host on the show is that we have to provide an opposing viewpoint to our guests in order to drive the conversation forward. And in this case, it's hard, but I'm going to try. Okay, so one of the arguments put forward is that even if it is the case that students of color, for example, have lower grades going into medical school, the idea would be that those lower grades are not due to a poorer capacity or a poorer ability. It's purely because of systemic injustice. It's because they haven't been afforded the opportunities of wealthier white students. And so their grades are lower because their school life is more challenging, not because they're weaker students. And once they enter medical school, they're able to overcome those challenges with their new education, and they land up being just as good, if not better, than white students entering medical school once they become doctors. So when you compare the performance of black doctors and white doctors, the argument could be made that black doctors will perform better under certain situations, perhaps when dealing with black patients. So how do you respond to those sort of objections?
Right. So I think it's an excellent point. I do think that race can be used in both admissions and hiring when it gives us useful information, or demographics in general. Take the case of admitting female physicians. If they're much less likely to perform, I think that their application should be discounted. Why? Because we're getting less production per individual for a female medical student. And if we have a shortage of physicians, and if medical services matter, and if they save lives and prevent serious harm, then we should take into account those things which statistically are validated to predict not only the quality of performance, but the quantity of performance. I should note that the view that Jason's suggesting and that I'm suggesting is certainly a minority view, right? Most people do not think, for example, that it's okay to hire only attractive flight attendants because that's what the flyers prefer, or that it's not okay in sort of all white parts of Alabama to only hire white teachers because that's what the children and parents prefer. That is, once we go down the path of preferring people's racial preferences, we should go down all the way. Now, I think we should. I think this should matter and we should take it into account, but that certainly is a minority view. This is in addition to the markets. I mean, it's very hard to see a market other than socialization markets like friendship and marriage, where there are these strong race-based preferences. And especially where you have differences. For instance, whether when one group, 10% flunks the medical boards, another one 40% flunk the boards. You might think people would say, well, look, I want to see in group, but I really don't want someone, 4 out of 10 of which, has a 40% likelihood of having flunked the boards, for example, or whose law school or grades were 2 standard deviations below the average law student. So my claim is, in addition to looking at other markets, I just claim that is not what customers would want, right? I think that customers would want people who would perform better, especially once these numbers have been known. And the challenge I would make is there another market area outside of socialization where people prefer in-group representation over performance when the difference is large? I can't think of one, and that tells us that because markets are probably the best indicator we have of what's efficient, that in fact emphasizing performance is probably more efficient than emphasizing in-group identity, number one, and number two, that people would prefer that as well.
So the Trump regime has just come out saying that they're going to remove all DEI policies and that the federal government will be based on merit and will be colorblind. Now, Coleman Hughes just produced a book on colorblindness. In South Africa, we have a value called non-racialism, which in its original meaning was meant to be the idea that we judge people based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin, in line with the Martin Luther King line. Would that be a better approach in all spheres, where you say we are not going to look at the race of applicants, we are only going to look at factors that are actually about merit, and you could take a view, for example, to say it's not about your raw score that you get out of high school. We could take into account how well you did in comparison to your peer group, for example. So some places have said the top 10% of students, as opposed to whether you got the top 10% nationally, we sort of look at your region or something like that. So you could take into account, for example, that a student who grows up in a poor neighborhood who manages to get a B+, despite having very few resources, might very well be the kind of superstar who does very well in comparison to a guy who gets the A-, but grew up in the lap of luxury. So you can just look at merit properly, but be race blind. And then if you have a race blind approach, then maybe a lot of your racial prejudice in society eventually fades away. So people's preference to have racial matching eventually disappears, and people then start to say, what matters most to me is performance, as you say. I want the best teacher for my kids. I want the best medical care. I trust that this person didn't get the job because of some racial preference or because the system is rigged against my racial group. I know that everybody had a fair opportunity to be here, and that you might wind up with differences in representation, but that's okay. Some communities want to, excel in basketball. Others want to excel in ice hockey, and that's just different. For example, in California, I think 90% of donut stores were run by Cambodians, and it's partly for like a very heartwarming reason, which is that there was a Cambodian who escaped the Khmer Rouge, and he worked as a janitor in Dunkin' Donuts, and eventually saved up enough money so that he could buy his own donut store. And then saw this as a path out for many of the other people who had survived the bleak Khmer Rouge regime, and he lent them money. And so this community then dominated that industry because of this historical anomaly. There's no injustice there whatsoever. There was no racial prejudice that allowed the Cambodians to dominate the industry. It's just that's how it went. There was a time when many tailors were Jews, for example, because they'd fled Eastern Europe with that skill. And so we shouldn't expect all aspects of society to have the same demographic representation. They're just going to be different preferences, different accidents of history. And that if people treat each other primarily as people as opposed to race representatives, that you would then wind up living in a better society.
Excellent. So, two superb points. One is, wouldn't we be better off with colorblindness? And two, once we have this, won't racism and differences fade away? Let me take the first point first. It's not obvious to me that we're better off by colorblindness. It doesn't seem to be a non-consequential principle. So take the notion that you can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex. Well, this doesn't seem to be a right to something. You don't have a right that someone, allow you onto their property or give you a job. It seems arbitrary, right? Why would you have a right against racial discrimination, but not against disability discrimination or age discrimination or sex discrimination or religious discrimination? It's not obvious to me that there is a right to colorblindness, and if you focus on a particular thing like a right to colorblindness, it seems arbitrary. Why colorblindness and not sex? What about a right not to be discriminated on the basis of things that you can't control? Well, that's not a right. I mean, if you're blind, you can't drive a truck. You might not, if you were born blind, you can't control that you're blind, but nevertheless, it seems to be perfectly appropriate to say you may not drive a truck if you're blind. And that's going to be an instance where you don't have a right that people judge you over things that you can't control. What about a bona fide job application, right? That race should not be a bona fide job application. Well, it's not clear why it's not a bona fide job application. I mean, just an obvious case, right? If you're doing undercover work in Chinatown, New York, you don't want a pasty white undercover agent. I mean, you're going to want someone who can pass off as someone who is part of the criminal world in Chinatown. So there doesn't seem to be a right not to be discriminated against on the basis of your race. And that's in part because you don't have a right that people interact with you. You don't have a right that they come on their property, and they don't have a right that you give them money rather than someone else. What about, could it achieve the best results? Well, it's not obviously the case, right? I mean, a lot of times demographics provide us with information. So why do we want people to have high MCAT scores and high GPAs? Not because they've earned it or because they have a high desert because they've achieved this, but rather we want it because it indicates performance. But demographics might also indicate performance. If an individual is a female, for example, and she's much more likely to stop working full-time as a physician, let's say, or as an attorney, or if she got a Harvard MBA, for example, then you might think, well, we're not getting the production for that individual. Even if her scores, let's say her MCAT scores and her GPA were just as high, we're not getting as much production from that individual. In that case, the demographic factor is a statistically valid predictor, and it's not clear why we would want to leave it on the table. Now, someone might respond, look, you just can't trust, once you let demographic considerations in, things go hogwire, you can't trust the government, they're completely untrustworthy. Maybe, but on the other hand, it might be quite a strong predictor. So, for example, if you had groups, let's say you had certain ethnic or racial groups that were underperforming given their scores, you might think we should discount their scores. So here's the analogy. If you had two groups applying to, let's just say, Pennsylvania Law School, UPenn Law School, and they're from Duke and Columbia, And for reasons the admissions officers cannot figure out, the Columbia students do much better than the Duke students, even once we control for their scores. Well, why wouldn't you discount the Duke applications or enhance the Columbia applications? But if that's true for the Duke and Columbia students, why wouldn't it be true for men and women? If it's true for men and women, if that were to be true, if it were to be true for races, why wouldn't you also do it for black and white? So it's not obvious to me as a matter of right we shouldn't consider race or sex. It's not obvious as a matter of getting the best predictors we can of performance that we shouldn't consider race or sex. But what we should do, I claim, when it comes to admitting law schools, we should use a pure algorithm. There's no reason for an admissions committee, right? What we should have is a 3-part factor, 3 or maybe 4-part factor. We have their MCAT scores times some constant, plus their GPA times some constant, plus demographic factors times some constant, and plus an additional factor, perhaps something like a personality feature like conscientiousness, grit. And that's going to predict it. Why would you use the sort of holistic admissions, viewing people as a whole, shifting criteria, vague seat of the pants judgments, which is what happens in almost every medical school today? For example, medical school admissions committees look at things like strength of recommendations, strength of essay, unstructured interview scores. Did they shadow physicians? Did they do charity work? What did they major in? There's no evidence that any of this predicts anything. Why would they look at this? Why wouldn't you use a pure algorithm in the same way that we use sabermetric equations in order to pick which baseball players to draft or which football players to draft or how much to pay them? Second, the notion that if we had a colorblind rules, we'd have a society free of racism or what's ordinary used as racism. I don't think this is true. I mean, there are cultural differences and people prefer similarity. Right? Similarity is a predictor of both friendship and marriage. It's also a predictor of success in marriage. Why would you want to encourage dissimilarity? Right? Among the economic reasons to have similarity are, number one, there's going to be less, the preferences are going to be closer together. And number two, it's going to be more efficient to figure out what a solution to those preference differences are and how to solve them. I just don't think it's true. I don't think that if you had colorblind rules, we'd get rid of racism, or we'd cease to care about race, or we'd cease to care about ethnicity. I think that the economic value of similarity would remain in place, and we'd still prefer a strong dose of homogeneity.
So 2 quick responses. The one is that you might think there's a distinction between fair and unfair discrimination. So you've given a series of cases where you say, look, it's fair to discriminate against the blind truck driver or the undercover agent. And I think those are all legitimate cases. So we might think that fair discrimination is when we can take into account your immutable characteristic for a good reason. But that there are going to be cases where it's not a good reason. So you say, okay, I've got this job and we're picking accountants, and I just don't like Jews. I think Jews killed Jesus, and so I'm not hiring a Jew. Seems like unfair discrimination. And you might think that someone has a good reason to object to being unfairly discriminated against. Maybe you cash it out as a right or as some sort of wrong that the person has suffered. But in the fair discrimination cases, we sort of have a reason to say, look, we had a good basis for denying you this, given that your immutable characteristic somehow mattered in this case. But in many cases, it won't matter. The second concern I have is if we start to think about certain things as public resources, so like health, we can then start to say, well, we're entitled to do this algorithmic thing to maximize the good for the benefit of all of us. And then you can trample on people's individual hopes and aspirations. So there's a famous story about Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she'd applied for a spot at, I think, Harvard Law School. They said to her, but you're a woman. And the odds are that as a woman, you're going to be in practice for a couple of years before you get pregnant and, you have a child, and then you're going to drop out like all the other women. So you need to justify why you should get one of these spots. And they ultimately let her in. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of those people who's probably had one of the biggest impacts on American law. And so it might very well be the case that if you use the generalization And it might very well be the case the generalization is true. So as you say, you've got data to back up the idea that women in medicine are much more likely to work half days instead of full days. That's still not a good reason to deny them the opportunity to become doctors, because we shouldn't think about people working in jobs as public goods. Rather, what we should say is that people should be given the opportunity to lead lives of their choosing, provided that they don't harm anyone else. And if they're less productive, well, then they take the economic cost on themselves. So if you only work a half day, you only get half pay. And maybe what you then need is to just allow market forces to take their role. So if there's a shortage of doctors or accountants or entertainers or whatever it is, then you want the market to provide more opportunities for people to be trained in those ways, and for the market to compensate them accordingly. Once you start to do the tinkering and you start to think like a sort of central planner, that's the road to eroding people's hopes and dreams, and the aim of achieving a greater good for everyone.
So a great point. So let me the first point you said, look, one distinction that might be relevant here is fair versus unfair discrimination. And sort of in arguing for the consideration of demographic considerations, I said, look, I was focusing on fair discrimination, but really the issue is an unfair discrimination. One, when it comes to private property, you might think, why is this relevant? I mean, if you own the property, why shouldn't you be able to allow who you want onto it? Let me give an analogy. Imagine someone had racial sexual preferences. So they prefer having sex with group X or group Y. And you might think, well, it's on your, in your house with your body and with the consent of the other person's body. There's no claim that someone else have sex with you because they're from a disfavored race. But you might think, why should we think that residences or businesses should be any different than sex if our focus is on rights? If you think the sort of natural rights are to body and the most quickly derived rights are those to property, you might think it's not clear what's wrong with unfair discrimination, the analogy being unfair discrimination with regard to things like sex, dating, and marriage. But second, let's say that you agree with this distinction, that you should be allowed to be involved in fair but not unfair discrimination. It's not clear why discriminating on the basis of race and sex is unfair discrimination. And if you have groups that systematically underperform relative to their scores, and you say, look, we're trying to maximize the amount of production, given the amount of resources we're putting into this, what's unfair about it? I mean, if you had a group, let's just say, group X underperformed relative to their MCATs and their GPAs. Let's say they underperformed by 16%. Why wouldn't you say, look, we should discount their application by 16%? What's unfair about that? In the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you might think, what would be the case for breaking away from the algorithm? Sure, we might miss a Ruth Bader Ginsburg every now and then. As a side note, I'm not a giant fan of her, but most people are. But the benefit of using this is we might have, 6 other male Ruth Bader Ginsburgs that you kept out of Harvard Law in virtue of this, right? Or you might have wasted 6 spots for people who decided to stay home with their children rather than using their Harvard Law degree. And you might think, okay, well, that's an enormous waste of a very valuable resource. So if you use the algorithm, you're going to get exactly the sort of unfair discrimination that you seem to be opposed to. So I guess my question would be, is it that you think we should use these algorithms and then have no admissions committees, right? They all you need is someone to sort of run the algorithm on the applications and have unfair discrimination accompany with it? Or do you think we should break away from the algorithms and use the sort of holistic judgment that can enhance someone's performance, even though they're from a demographic group that underperforms relative to their numbers?
So just to defend Mark, which I hate doing, but just to defend Mark's point a little bit. So you could cash out Mark's view in a way that doesn't refer to groups. So you could say this particular student should have their score weighted up, should be multiplied by a factor of greater than 1, because this particular student underwent a difficult life. Now, some people would cash that out as this student went through a difficult life because their parents didn't have money because they're descendants of slaves and they've suffered systemic racism. But you don't have to cash out the explanation that way. You could just say this student had fewer resources when studying than this other student and performed slightly worse, but in light of their unfavorable circumstances, it's quite impressive that they achieved the results that they did. Couldn't you cash out a person's performance in terms of their particular background where that background doesn't have any group terms in its description?
I think that's a logical impossibility. When you look at things like an MCAT score or a GPA, you're looking at groupings. What does it mean to have a 4.0? What does it mean to have a 98% MCAT? So, in using statistically validated predictors, I think you have to look at groups. The groups might not be racial or sexual demographics, but they do have to be groups. So, I think it's logically impossible. And by the way, I think that's true even if one were to think, as one brilliant philosopher I know does, that there are no actual groups ontologically, but just individuals. So this is not an ontological claim. It's just the way in which we statistics work.
But I'd be okay with that, by the way, Steve. I'd be okay with that because that's just mere aggregation. So you're not grouping in the terms in terms of a social group. You're just saying here's a collection of scores, and we need to look at statistical properties of this collection of scores.
But my question is, if we're looking at statistically valid predictors, why would we look at score-based predictors but not demographic-based predictors? I mean, an accurate and valid predictor is valuable. Or, I mean, if I'm lacking the argument for one sort of predictor and not the other, in terms of the notion that a person had a difficult life and he's going to perform better, I don't think this is true, but if we had evidence this is true, then we certainly should take that into account. If we had something which said, look, this predicts someone's going to perform much better than their scores because of this difficult life, then absolutely we should enhance their application. I just don't think we see this. In addition, note the valuation mechanism you're using, right? If you look at someone who had a disadvantaged background and you say, well, on average, they're going to perform less well as a medical student and less well as a physician, what about the person's patients? I mean, why focus on the interests of the medical student rather than the patients that he's going to serve? I don't see any reason for that. And I especially don't see any reason if the patients are of the same demographic group of the physician. So I think your point's an excellent one. I just think, once you're into statistically valid predictors, you're into them. And that might carry demographics with it, no matter how ugly and distasteful that is. And second, the notion that people are going to perform better because they had a difficult life, I just don't see any evidence for that. If you did, we should take that into account. And third, what about the patients?
So two rejoinders. The one would be in the case of statistical predictors that are based on aggregation, that aren't based on racial markers. There's no conflation between causation and correlation there. You're just looking at straight correlation. But when you talk about, let's say, someone's race being a predictor of their performance, there it seems like you're talking about causation, right? And so it could be that someone's race is correlated with their performance. I mean, that's entirely possible, but their performance could also be correlated by the number of Nicolas Cage movies produced that year. And it could be statistically significant too. It doesn't mean that that you should be looking at it. So we have to look carefully about whether what we're talking about is mere correlation or it's causation. And when what you're doing is you're trying to work out whether a particular score is good within the general field, that seems totally rational, right? It seems completely rational to say, what is my particular score compared with all the other students of my year nationally? That seems like a really good measure, and there's no reason why we would think that that's not a good measure. But when you ask, well, the fact that I'm black, that could predict lower performance going forward, well, now there's this difficult question about are we confusing causation with correlation there? Second rejoinder is, but have you established that if a student who comes into law school and has slightly worse scores, will he land up being a worse doctor? I understand that you're saying that in general, lower scores going in means lower performance coming out, but I'd be curious to know when you look at those studies whether they are adjusted for race.
Okay, so two things here. One, the first objection, which is an excellent one, which is that when we're looking at these scores like MCAT scores or GPA or LSAT scores, we're looking at correlation, but when we look at demographic factors, we're looking at causation. So I think that's a really interesting point, but I want to flat out deny it. I think what we want is whatever will validly predict something. Now, if correlation alone will do that, that's fine. If valid prediction requires causation, as I think some theories of philosophy of science require, then that's what we require. But whatever's going to do the valid prediction, even if we have no idea why it's having an effect. So again, imagine that when letting people into University of Pennsylvania Law School, the Columbia students do much better than the Duke students, even though they enter with the same numbers. I mean, I want to know, okay, well, why is that? We don't know, but we know that one group does better than another. I mean, why do we have to know? We know that one group's going to do better than the other. Why not favor the application of the Columbia students and disfavor the application of the Duke students in response to that? Second, there was a suggestion that the MCAT score and the GPA score is a better measure than demographics. Well, that's true, but if demographics add to the predictive accuracy, why would you leave useful information on the table? So, for example, if the MCAT score is a better predictor than undergraduate GPA, but both predict better than the MCAT alone, you'd want to use both. And I think we do the same thing with demographics. If the MCAT score plus demographics outperforms the MCAT score alone, you'd want to use both. You'd want to use whatever valid predictor you can have. And again, whether that's correlation or causation, I'm not sure which it is, but I'm not sure whether it matters. We want to use whatever is the valid predictor. In terms of input and output, it's a little bit hard to measure sort of what makes a good physician. But if you look at things like, who's disciplined for the practice of medicine, or pretty much, performance in general. So one of the best predictors of performance we have among all the predictors out there is IQ, right? It's not a very polite thing to say, but it is an extraordinarily strong predictor, and certainly almost nothing else that predicts as well. Well, if these scores reflect IQ, then that's going to tell you that the lower scores are probably going to perform less because of what's true in other fields outside of medicine. And by the way, that's true for jobs which require high cognitive ability, a medium cognitive ability, and the low cognitive ability. Even in the small, narrow groups, like really advanced students, right, the top 1% of their performance, even their IQ differences are good predictors. So I think everything we know about medicine, although like I said, there's not a clear study of how well physicians perform relative to their MCATs and their board scores, but everything we know about medicine in terms of board scores, performance, and everything we know outside of medicine tells us that IQ is a pretty strong predictor. Things like the LSAT and the MCAT are going to be heavily G-loaded, that is heavily tied in with IQ. So I think there's every reason to believe that the people who score lower are going to be worse physicians. And let me emphasize the cash value of this. Because we're talking law of large numbers, if we're talking 340 million people getting medical services, when you have a diminishment in the ability of physicians or diminishment in the quantity of physician services, overall there's going to be a lot of extra deaths and injuries that you could have otherwise avoided by having selected differently. That is, by having selected according to the best valid predictors we have.
So I want to give you some reasons to think that using demographic information might make your predictions worse. So let's say, for example, that a particular racial group on average has a high IQ score. Okay. And so we say, well, then we'll just use the race as a proxy for IQ. So a particular applicant comes forward, they're from that racial group, and instead of testing their IQ, you just say, well, you're part of that group, so we assume that you're very smart. Turns out that they're not, because all we know is that the group on average has an higher IQ score. So we know, for example, that Dutch people are generally much taller than North Koreans, probably by about a foot on average. But if you have a very tall North Korean, and you're picking basketball players, it would be strange to say, well, sorry, you're North Korean, and so North Koreans on average are very short. And he says, but it's quite clear that I'm 6'5". You ought not to discriminate against me. And so you might think that the demographic data is, let's say, giving you averages about useful underlying mechanisms, but that you should rather focus on the useful underlying mechanisms than demographic data. The other one is that there's an arbitrariness in how we work out who's part of the demographic group. So to work out who counts as white, for example, in America, and you say, let's say that's the group that you're looking at, it might be much more useful to say, well, are you of Italian descent or German descent or Irish descent or Russian descent? And you're going to wind up, just for example, on income, with very, very different scores for all of those little subgroups. So why use Caucasian as your category when actually you've got all this difference? I mean, you definitely find this with people who are designated as black in America, that there's a difference if you're Caribbean or if you are a recent immigrant from Nigeria. Immigrants from Nigeria in the UK, for example, tend to earn much more than people who are Caucasian in the UK. So the clustering of the demographic group actually might give you much more noise than signal. And so that seems like a reason to ignore it and instead just go and look at the things that are actually predictive.
So two excellent points. Number one, focusing on demographic groups might make things worse because you're not using the best valid predictor you have. Rather, you're shortcutting by looking at demographics. And two, it seems to be arbitrary. Why look at things like, race? Are you white or you're black, or are you Asian or you're Hispanic? Rather than looking at subgroups. So it seems to be arbitrary as well. Okay, the first point, I agree with you. I mean, if better data is available, you should use that. But the question is, should you supplement the data with demographic data if that makes your prediction even better? That is, if adding to your MCAT score and your GPA along with the race gives you even a better predictor than the MCAT score and the GPA, why wouldn't you take all three into account? Take the case of sex with medical students, right? If it's the case that sex tells us how many hours someone will work, that seems to be an accurate predictor. Why would we leave that off the table? And also, this concedes that race might be a useful indicator where we don't have the time or the resources to actually measure what we really want to measure. So, for example, imagine that you're attending the University of California at Berkeley, and you're in a chem lab, and you got to pick a chem lab partner. And you don't have time, nor would anyone allow you to IQ test your fellow classmates. Well, if there were a 300-point IQ difference, for example, between, let's say, Asians and blacks, why wouldn't you take that into account in deciding which lab partner with whom to work? In addition, when it comes to arbitrators, I agree with you. Why would you use sloppy categories like white or black or Asian or Hispanic rather than subcategories? I think that's absolutely right. But again, where you don't have data for those fine-grained categories, then you have to use the data that you have. So going back to the Columbia and Duke case, it was unfair because you're not distinguishing between Duke engineering students versus Duke English majors, and Columbia physics majors versus Columbia communication majors. It'd be better if we had the better data, but that doesn't tell us that when we don't have the better data available, we shouldn't use demographic criteria. So I guess I agree with both your points. I'm not sure that defeats the overall claim that as a practical matter, we should consider these things, number one. And number two, that we should give them weight where they're serious, valid predictors of future performance.
So maybe the concern is that using an argument similar to yours, we could generate some very bizarre counterexamples. So, for example, let's just say that we need to punish certain types of crimes with a death sentence. And let's just say that certain types of crimes are more likely to be committed by certain races over other races. And we stop paying attention to who committed a particular crime, but just which racial group was the most likely for committing the crime. So a member of which group was most likely to commit a certain crime. So let's just say, for example, that when we look at hijackings in some future dystopic American state are punishable by the death sentence. And let's just say that Jews are the most likely people to commit hijackings, followed by Russians, followed by Vietnamese people in certain proportions. And so what we do is every year we just hand out a certain number of death sentences for the number of hijackings that have occurred that year, and we allocate them in a distribution that matches statistically, what we found in the past when we did care about who actually committed the crimes, which racial groups whose members were most likely to perform these crimes, we could just hand out the death sentences accordingly. Now, I think that we'd all agree that that would be a bad system. It would be an unjust system. It wouldn't be cool. But on your view, it's not clear why there's a problem with doing this. Because, well, your race is a good predictor of whether or not your particular group committed the crime. And if you look at the statistics of large numbers, it's going to work out in the end. It doesn't really matter whether you committed the crime or not, just like it doesn't matter whether Ruth Bader, Bader Ginsburg was a good lawyer or not. If she had not been allowed into the position she was allowed into, there was a good chance, as you say, that maybe a really good male lawyer would have taken her spot, an even better one. Um, so, so it seems like if we hand out these death sentences in the right proportions to the right groups, we've achieved something like a system you want, right? We've allocated justice according to racial belonging instead of according to individual actions, which is what Mark and I are arguing would be an alternative to your system is, which is you look at the individual circumstance and performance of someone's actions, their past, their circumstances for their marks, for their scores, and then you allocate them a leg up or a leg down accordingly.
So, in terms of the death penalty, I mean, one problem with kind of distributing according to groups, executing the Jews because they commit the most capital crimes, is that still, I mean, you want it to be just for the individual, and there seems to be a problem with beyond a reasonable doubt. Even if you are, accurately tracking the percentage of individuals, there is a problem with, do you have a beyond a reasonable doubt with regard to this one individual? If you thought beyond a reasonable doubt is sort of like a bare minimum before you execute someone or give them a life sentence, then of course there'd be a problem applying this to individuals. But let me apply your approach to sort of a different case, which actually occurs, which is the probation and parole. Imagine you have an algorithm system, and they do actually use these to help the judge decide whether or not to grant parole, for example. Now, why would you not want to use an algorithm, right? If the algorithm were to, let's say, do two things that we both valuable, that is, maximize the number of people who we don't keep incarcerated, and also minimize the number of violent crime that results from parolees, I'm a little unsure why you wouldn't use an algorithm, period. I mean, why have the algorithm only provide evidence for the judge and allow the judge to second guess it? I mean, what makes us think that the judge can outperform this algorithm? And if he can't, then why should he have the ability not to follow it? Or why would we encourage him not to follow it?
Why can't we run the same argument in the death penalty case? So why can't we say, well, the judge, how do you know he's going to make a better prediction than just the person's racial group belonging?
And I don't think he is. So, I mean, imagine you had an AI system. So a lot of the things we use to identify who are guilty, we look at things like eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, and whether the person gives a confession. Now, these things, some of them are not terribly accurate, right? But when we combine them, you might think, okay, together they're accurate. And if we had an artificial intelligence system that made a more accurate judgment than a judge, why would we want to introduce inaccuracy into the system by having a human judge it? That was what would be the case in terms of either justice or in terms of good consequences to have some judge make the decision rather than artificial intelligence. I can't see any justification for this whatsoever, whether it's in terms of good consequences or injustice. And here's an analogy. Imagine that you were going to select a spouse, and someone tells you, look, this algorithm, run by an artificial intelligence, unit is going to pick you a much better spouse over the long haul than you pick for yourself. Why would you ever turn over your spousal selection to your own intuition or holistic judgment rather than the algorithm? Now, it might be that you have the right to make the decision, that the artificial intelligence will be able to bind you, but why would you ever make the spousal selection decision based on your own intuition rather than algorithm? And if that's true for your selecting a spouse, why wouldn't that be true with regard to death penalty cases? And why wouldn't it be true with regard to parole cases?
So you're biting the bullet on that case. So we should hand out the death penalty based on based on whether you belong to a certain social group, not whether you committed it or not. It doesn't matter if Mark or I did the hijacking. We're Jews, so one of us got to go.
Well, no, because I mean, it's not like Jews as a whole forfeit their rights. I mean, and so like, well, you and Mark are Jews, so one of you is going to have to pay the price. I mean, it's got to be focused on the individual. So I'm not sure I see that analogy as being on point. But if you're asking, if Jones is appearing before the judge, and we have eyewitness testimony, fingerprint testimony, and a confession, and we want to know, is that sufficient evidence to convict the person and execute them? And if our choices are feed it into an algorithm, which has a 99% accuracy, or let some half-assed judge decide it who has 90% accuracy, why would we ever let the judge decide it rather than the algorithm system?
Yeah, so to be fair to Steve, to get a sense of the bullet that he's biting, he's basically saying that, like you take IQ and MCAT and race into account, you would take race into account in determining whether someone gets the death penalty. So if we're like, I don't know if this guy did it, but he's a Jew, that's going to push us over the edge because Jews are much more likely to commit crimes. So it's not just we kill any random Jew, it's just that we take it into account for tipping the scales when we pull that switch on the electric chair.
Yeah, Mark said it much better than me. Yeah, I agree. If adding demographic data increases our accuracy in terms of convicting people and assigning sentences, again, why leave useful data on the table? Like, what's the moral argument for that? It doesn't be a rights-based argument. Let me just ask you this. I mean, why, if adding demographics increases the accuracy of both the conviction and the penalty, what's the argument for leaving it out?
It can be very hard to object to you, Steve, because the way you put it is the way I would frame the objection. In other words, what you're biting is the reductio that I would be I would be giving against the case. And you're like, yeah, I can't see a reason why we wouldn't do that. So let's look at the case that you mentioned around choosing your spouse. So I mean, there is a little bit of evidence that people would agree with you. There's one of my favorite really trashy reality TV shows is called Married at First Sight, where people on the show get married in episode one based on how judges allocate two partners as compatible. So in other words, a whole thousands and thousands of people apply, and then the judges match them and on episode one, blindly, they walk up to a chuppah and they get married. Um, and then the rest of the show continues. And apparently, when they first started the show, the marriage was a legally binding marriage. And in the later seasons, they're now up to season 18 or 19, and it now has offshoots in Australia, UK, and America. It's very popular. It's really good trashy TV. Now, apparently, it's no longer a legally binding marriage to start with, but at the end of the season, if they're still together, they get to renew their vows for the first time, effectively. Um, but the point is, those kind of TV shows agree with you. You should leave it up to the algorithm. The algorithm in this case is the experts. But the reason the show is so popular is because that's vastly counterintuitive. We don't think that the experts will get it right. And statistically, they actually get it wrong most times. In other words, most of the couples don't last, most of them break up. You're going to say, well, it's not a good enough algorithm, right? If you get a better algorithm, they'll stay together. But there's so much sci-fi that's been written on this. There's lots of Netflix series on this with exactly this premise that there's going to be an AI that will tell you who your ideal life partner is, and it never works out. And of course, the person who's matched with someone else falls in love with a third person, and they run off. That's the typical storyline. Because, well, there's some ineffable quality to love, and just like there's, in this case, not an ineffable quality, but someone either committed the crime or they didn't. There's that undeniable feature of truth. Um, maybe algorithms and probabilities just don't belong in certain decisions.
So, a couple of things to say here. One, I'm not sure there is an ineffable quality of love. There might be to romance early on, but in terms of a long-term stable marriage, which is really sort of meaningful, and the people are not only spouses but close friends, I'm just not sure that's true. And second, even if there is an ineffable quality, why not think it's overridden by the concern that you actually have a marriage that lasts and that's meaningful and rewarding for the couples. That is why take the risk. And here's an analogy. Take the case of self-driving cars and people driving cars. Imagine that self-driving cars are on average much safer, both in terms of to the driver or the people in the car, but also people elsewhere. But I mean, it's kind of disturbing when you have cars out there and they're no one's driving them. You don't see anyone. I mean, what would be the case for discouraging self-driving cars? Imagine someone said, well, there's kind of an affable quality to driving. And maybe there is. And maybe there's a lot of joy to driving that a self-driving car is not going to provide. On the other hand, if you have, and I'm making this figure up, 10,000 people dead on the highways and a lot of other people who are sort of badly injured, you might think, well, I mean, the ineffable quality is, a good thing, but it's outweighed by avoiding, people becoming handicapped and killed. So I guess I think just like you might think statistically we were brought off with self-driving cars, maybe not mandatory, but encouraged. Maybe we should have, algorithms with regard to marriage. And here's my second argument, which is a fiddler on the roof argument. I mean, why do people rely on matchmakers so much? You might think precisely because you don't want to allow a 20-year-old, right, head over heels in love to make bad decisions, whereas matchmakers have the jaundiced eye, which is why they brought them in. So I think both in terms of achieving the best results, acting prudently, and acting consistently with Fiddler on the Roof, we should use algorithms. Right? So an algorithm is just a matchmaker whom you have to pay a lot less.
Well, Steve, always a pleasure having you on the show. And for those of you watching, we want to hear from you. We promise all sorts of wonderful, weird, and great delights on the show. So you got to hear about sex, death, marriage, racism, all the best things. So we'd love to hear your comments and let us know on YouTube or let us know on Spotify.